Welcome to Complying with the TRACED Act, 5 Things You Should Know, our 35th web education event covering technical, business, and partner topics to help service providers and enterprises build better voice networks. The Telephone Robocall Abuse, Criminal, and Deterrence Act, or the TRACED Act, was signed into law December 30th, 2019, introducing a number of new regulations that are designed to stamp out illegal robocalling and improve trust in the telephone network. The regulations impact a wide range of TDM and SIP-based service providers across the United States. Many parts of the Act have deadlines approaching requiring immediate action. Stay with us as we take a closer look at 5 actions that service providers can undertake to achieve and maintain compliance without expensive upgrades. We'll leave plenty of time for some Q&A, so let's get going. Before we move on, a quick moment to tell you about some of the other resources we have available on Telco Bridge's YouTube channel. From past webinar recordings, case studies, online training, and many how-to videos, there is some content for almost everyone on the channel. Take a peek at youtube.com/telcobridges and be sure to subscribe and keep up with all the new content. Well, let's move on to some introductions. And I'm Alan Percy. I'm the Telco Bridge CMO and host for today's event. And joining us today is Mark Iannuzzi. He is the founder of TelNet Worldwide and the Director of Government Affairs for the Cloud Communications Alliance. And Mark, thanks again for sharing some of your time and your expertise.
Alan, great to be with you and everybody today. Welcome. I'm glad to be here.
We're glad to have you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to cover real quick some of the items on the agenda. We've got a little bit more in the introduction phase, and then we're going to talk about the problem. I think most people understand that, so it'll be quick. And then we'll get into some of the government actions and then move on to how to comply with the TRACED Act and some of the things that are necessary. And then we'll wrap up with some solutions for SIP and TDM network operators. And then some more resources in the Learn More section. And then, of course, spend some time in your Q&A as we get towards the end of the event. So lots to cover. So let's get moving. All right. And it would always, as always, see quite a new, fresh new faces. So I just want to quick introduce who Telco Bridge is, and then we'll move on to Mark's company. Telco Bridge is a manufacturer of VoIP media gateways and session border controller software. It's a 40-person company, employee-owned. It's been around since 2002, headquartered in Canada, and they manufacture all the hardware equipment and do all the software development and design and much of the support out of the Montreal office. But we also have support offices in Turkey, Hong Kong, and more recently, we added a sales office in Italy. And that way we can do our 24/7 technical support and with follow the sun. So great opportunity to learn about the company. And Mark, want to tell us a little bit about TelNet Worldwide?
Sure, absolutely. So as Alan, as you described, I'm the president and founder of TelNet Worldwide. We're headquartered right near Detroit. We started out in 1998. We're a facilities-based carrier. So we've been going at this for quite some time here. And what we've developed here is what we like to call a full stack communication service. We operate data centers, the networking connectivity, the calling stacks, the unified communications, and contact center capabilities. So you kind of pick your pleasure when you get within that environment that we bring to the table as a carrier. I also have the privilege to serve on the Cloud Communications Alliance. Cloud Communications Alliance is a group of I'll call them next generation service providers. They're not carriers, but they operate different platforms. They might have built it themselves, or they might have worked with somebody like Cisco or NetSapient or somebody like that. And they'll source their numbers and things of this ilk from different carriers. But they're a great group of people, a lot of innovation going on there. And so we're quite active in many different areas. And what I serve as their director for government affairs and regulatory matters. And there'll be a couple of things that'll come along during the slide presentation that we were very much instrumental in during this past couple of years.
Yep. No, that's great. And also, Tobacco Ridges is a member of the CCA, and we get a lot out of it. So highly recommended. Excellent. All right. So let's just move on real quick and talk about the problem. And Mark, you've brought some new statistics that bring some new perspective on this.
Yeah. Well, I think everybody knows here that we're just getting inundated with spam, unwanted spam, and robocalling activities. This actually goes back a couple of years for this data. But more recently, I was listening to a presentation. There's about 4 to 5 billion calls still going on a month in terms of spam generated calls. And it's just been growing. And this is why the industry has gotten together. We got to do something about it. And we can see some of the countries here, United States actually is in the middle of the pack in terms of how bad it is, but it's still a significant issue.
Yep.
Well, next slide.
Sure.
So, all robocalling is not bad robocalling. There's a lot of reasons why companies go out there and they'll change their name, in terms of their identity because of how they need to reach the customer, or just in terms of how the robocalling works. So things like payment reminders or an office appointment for a medical visit, these are all good things, and we want those good things to come through. The issue here is the bad stuff, where 40% of this is about scams. This is about things that have been going on here to hurt us all. And this is it for me, in terms of being a carrier, over the years of different things that have transformed the telecommunications network. This is perhaps the most important thing that the industry has gotten together on in a decade at least. And that's why we're very passionate about it and very excited to be part of the solution.
Oops. Yep. All right. So let's move on and let's talk about some of the government actions.
Yeah. So, like any problem here, it's not a one size fit all. There's a lot of different parties that have to come together. The work on the mitigation of illegal, unwanted robocalling and spoofing really kicked off in earnest about in 2014. The FCC was really trying to get the industry to take a lead in this, which it did. So through standard organizations like ADIS, an engineering task force group, there's a lot of different things that started to move forward. And then as we've gotten over the past few years, we've seen where the FCC and our legislative bodies have taken a more active role to put some more sting into the equation, a little bit more structure into things. So we have the legislative support. So Alan, you mentioned about the TRACED Act that just passed into the law. It's been about a year now. And it really provides a framework and guidance about giving the FCC some authority to move forward. So the regulatory support. But then there's the technology. There still is the industry that's come together to how we detect, assess, get the mechanism so that we can put that trust back into the network. And also, how the customer itself wants to be involved in this process. We get into things we'll talk about in a bit about call blocking. Well, is it something that you want to do as a carrier on your own, or what kind of tools and capabilities will you give to your to the end user themselves? So once again, it's a kind of a team sport here.
Yeah, and I think that's probably one of the most important parts of it. It took coordination between the legislative side of the Justice Department, and then of course the technology to really put together a solution. And this is all part of it.
Yeah. Yeah. So this year, the most current thing, it still goes back to the most seminal thing that's taken place here is the TRACED Act that was signed into law in 2019. But you have to put some sting into these things. So here's where penalties for violations come in. This is where it compels operators to employ the new technologies involved with the stir shaken capabilities and VoIP networks. And also, I want to make sure that business have a way to resolve things, that if things do get blocked, how do they go and get that turned around? Because you don't want to, if you catch good calls into the net, people want to figure out how they get out of that pretty quickly.
Mhm.
So this here was really the most substantial thing that's taken place in the past 12 months was the passage of this law.
And during a period of very divided government, it was one of the few things that got wide
Yeah.
bipartisan support. So it's good to have happen.
Yeah,
Yep.
you know what's also interesting about this, and getting into this next slide as well. Typically, when you have the ball being handed to industry to go in and do, to kind of fix these things, put the standards in how you work together, and not have a legal or regulatory framework forcing it, that typically would be something you would think people were very much in favor of. But then even in the industry, you needed some other referee to help keep everybody together. So the passage of the act and then the FCC's involvement, I do find as being a way to help herd the cats together, so to speak.
That's a good way.
Going back a ways, FCC's listed out a number of different things. These go back a few years now, but this first part here about permits operators to block certain types of cause if they have reasonable cause, and also bringing in texting into this thing as well. Yep. This first part here was one of the things that the CCA was actually quite concerned about, because what they did at the FCC is they granted safe harbor to carriers that they would not get into trouble for blocking calls that might have otherwise not been okay. So as an industry participant, as a service provider, you want to get legitimate calls through. So if the other side of the terminating service provider is blocking calls erroneously, there wasn't really a good mechanism that was put into play to say, hey, that I didn't even know, for example, that you blocked the call. And then if you did block the call, well, who do I talk to and how do I resolve that? And there was a lot of concern, especially by smaller service providers, that the bigger boys could use this to their advantage. And so one of the things that came out this past year, and we'll probably get to that in a moment, was about how the redress mechanisms and the notification things are now part of the regulatory process here. And if you're going to block a call, you have to be able to get back to the originating provider.
Got it. Interesting. Okay. All right, some bits about the TRACED Act mandate.
Yeah. So now the TRACED Act, we got a deadline coming up here in June. All carriers that have an IP-based capability with their networks are supposed to have stir, shake, and rolling. There was a carve out now for smaller carriers with less than 100,000 lines can get an extension for a couple more years, buy a little time in there. But there's caveats to it, and it's at the bottom bullet point here. You need to have a mitigation plan. You just can't say, okay, I'm small and I can't get out of it. You need to make sure that there is something that you as a carrier are doing to stop illegal behavior at the source. So that's important. But then there's another part to this I'd like to point out, is that while you may be, as a smaller carrier, be exempted and you need to get some time to get this thing under your belt, there's a competitive issue here, because one is that when you're sending calls out, that's one thing about them getting blocked and you're able to resolve that on behalf of your customers right away. But then if you don't have these tools in your toolbox, now your ability to help your end users know the fidelity of that call will be not as good as the next guy down the street who can do that and perhaps be bragging about that they're not only signing on the way out, but making sure the stuff that's coming in is good. And
I think initially, I think that signing on the way out is really the most critical thing, because if the calls are not signed when they leave a smaller service provider's network, it's entirely possible that larger service providers may not necessarily block it right away, but they will not give it the attestation to the consumer, right? They won't get the validated check mark or the valid call display on a mobile phone, for example.
Right. That is absolutely right. When we get into the attestations, to remind folks here, as a practical matter, if you don't get an A attestation, to me, I'm not sure who's going to pick up a call that's not given an A. I really find that kind of hard to So it'd
It's
be
an A
it's a
or basically
competitive
an
thing,
F, right?
right?
Yeah.
It's basically an A or an F, right?
Yeah.
And the another point that's right here in the center is the stir shaken is about an IP based technology. It's about SIP based protocols and how we insert the authentication headers into it. So in terms of there's a lot of TDM network out there. We operate a lot of TDM, and there needs to be an ability now to work on that. And there's been an approach, and I know you're going to get into a little bit later here about out of band shaken, which is really important to try to create a bridge to a way that the TDM network is part of the solution as well.
All right. So I think it behooves us to just spend a couple of minutes on understanding how stir shaken and some of the names and elements in it. So why don't you take it from here?
Yeah. This is always the James Bond thing about the whole stir shaken.
Yes, there
Part
is.
of this. So STIR, for just to make sure our acronym friendly, our acronym crazy industry that we're in here, but Secure Telephone Identity Revisited. This is about from the Internet Engineering Task Force. And when you want to think about these guys actually kind of create the standards about how things should be packaged up. And then the next piece here, the shaken part, is really about an implementation of a standard. And this is where the ADIS folks in the SIP forum come in. And this is where the signature handling of asserted information using tokens. So anyway, stir shaken makes it easy to
yeah. It's a bit of a stretch when it comes to acronyms, but it works.
It does work, yeah.
It's made for some good parties at the SIP forum, I'll tell you that.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Yeah. So here are these attestation levels that you can assert about the fidelity of a call. So this is the responsibility of the originating service provider. If it doesn't exist within the header, then it's going to be assumed to be a C. But the A level is what we talked about before. This is what you want. You want to make sure you're delivering that if to the extent you comply with this, that the service provider does have the ability to insert this information into their IP network stream. They have a direct relationship with the customer, and they can verify that their phone number that is coming from them is actually been assigned to that customer. There's where you get the star in your forehead and the full attestation. B is basically,
that's probably the most key thing of all we're going to talk about stir shaken is the importance of this is to get an A attestation, to put an A attestation, essentially the service provider saying, I know this customer and I know this customer owns this number or has the right to use this number.
Exactly. It's that being able to stitch that together, which sometimes isn't always that straightforward as a thing, is to, when you get a call coming to your network, can you, for example, make sure that the endpoint that it's coming from was actually registered to that customer? So you can say, aha, yes, I got that one. I do now know how to tie the phone number back to the customer, and everything's working good. But that's where you want to be. The B level one it's pretty close, but that one-to-one relationship that the service provider would know that actual telephone number is really, they know that it's been associated to that customer, but they can't tell you for sure that who's originating is actually using it. So you get a downgrade there. And the last thing here is really what they call gateway. And all they say is that, hey, I have no relationship with this thing. I'm just passing this thing through. You see that through a lot of transiting relationships, international gateways, which is a whole different kettle of fish here about, where a preponderance of with the spoofing is coming from is overseas. And there's some pretty draconian measures being placed or talked about being placed regarding international gateway traffic.
Yeah, and one of the questions that comes up sometimes, why does C even exist? Well, I think the biggest reason that C exists is that if a call comes in off an international gateway, it's not signed, right? It lands on a gateway provider, and then what happens then is that the provider puts the C attestation. What it does then too is it also leaves breadcrumbs in that attestation, so that as the call then traverses the North American network, if somebody receives it and has a complaint about it, they can trace it all the way back to the gateway where it entered the U.S. market, and therefore makes it a lot easier to figure out where the call came from and who the bad guy was.
Yeah, very important point.
Good. Okay.
Okay, so the basic mechanisms of which the framework comes together. Once again, you see on the left-hand side of this slide is all the those involved, from ADA, SIP Forum, Internet Engineering Task Force, FCC. So this all comes together under that framework. But the basic mechanics pretty straightforward, if you will. You have the originating, the calling party makes that call, it hits their particular originating service provider. That's where that integrity check takes place, right there. And they figure out what can they do with that particular call, A, B, or C. Once they figure that out, then they're going to go and reach out through an authentication service to get to the certificate authority. And this is how then we can get an encrypted key to package up into the header that goes into the SIP message, what the attributes that are being collected for traceback reasons and for, once again, the attestation level. So once that then is, that encrypted information key is provided, it packs into the header, it's then pumped out over the network. Now the terminating service provider has the ability to then unwrap that. So they're going to go and reverse the process with a verification service and take apart the header and see if it actually was authentic, meaning did they get a legitimate header packet? Because that's key, because once again, somebody sent along a piece of bogus information. You want to have a way to make sure that the integrity was done. Then with assuming that it was properly done, for example, then you get into different call treatment concepts here and how this would play into what the terminating service provider is going to provide to their end user. Now, you don't know for sure what the intention of the particular caller was. So if there's going to be other kind of treatments or activities for blocking, it typically is not just because it was given a C. It had to be because there was something else that was going on. And with respect to what if there's a blocking, or even what comes out on the display. Perhaps maybe more recently, people on the have seen on their cell phones in particular, where it'll come up and say on the caller ID that this might be spam. Well, that's where somebody has taken some of these type of steps to say, hey, I think this is not a legit party, with or without the proper, once again, it could come in with hypertechnically could come in with an AS attestation and still be considered to be a spam call.
Correct. Yep. In fact, there's a question here. I'm just dropping in here. Asks about, what to expect on the caller display. And one thing that I think is important to understand is that the ADIS has given maybe some recommendations or steered people towards a certain direction. It's really up to the service provider as to what they want to display. But the result of the verification service is either, yes, it was verified, or no, it didn't. It did not achieve verification. And those call validation treatment systems use the knowledge as to whether or not the call had been verified as part of their algorithms, but they also use a lot of other attributes, as Mark indicated. So it might be, the number has been suspect because it's seen a lot of traffic on it all of a sudden, or, gee, this is the number from one of my own customers. What is it doing come in, in a gateway? This is kind of odd. There's all kinds of criteria that would make them suspicious of the call. But knowing that the call passed its validation is an important element of making those decisions. And then what they display on the phone, it depends on if it's a wireline or wireless operator. Are they doing traditional caller ID, or do they have digital displays, those kinds of things? And again, what actually is displayed is not in a lot of these specifications. There's some recommendations, but it's not hard coded at this point.
Yeah, that's very important there. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so to get into the club,
let me interrupt for a second. So kind of asking the questions, well, gee whiz, I'm a carrier and I need to set this thing up. Where do I get the certificate from? Where do I get, how do I get a CA to turn over a certificate?
Oh, well, hey, right here is the way we do it.
Exactly.
So to get into the club, the way there's these trust triangles. I think some like to talk about in terms of the different administrators. There's another slide that we could share with the group later if you like, Alan. But
Yep.
it shows the interplay of how this structure goes in there to create trust in the system. But as a service provider, there's three things that are been laid out from the get-go to anoint you to say, hey, these people are they're good. Let them in. They're a good, they're a trusted service provider. So one is that you have to be filing a 499 form with the FCC. There might be some exceptions to that, but that's when you're continuing. If you're a carrier and service provider, you should be very well aware of what 499s are. The next thing here is the operating company number, the OCN. So as a carrier in particular, you would then, as you go to get numbering resources, they come by virtue of securing that you are a legitimate carrier and that you now can go and petition and get a carrier operating number. And then that then lets you get access to the numbering pools through NAMPA and so forth. So if you have these three things, you're able to get into the club and be able to now get the signing of stuff, of the calls. Now, there's 3 points here that actually have come up here that can add color to this. So, for example, my company, we're a carrier, we have OCNs, okay? So we're able to get right into the front door when this thing first started out. But we also secure phone numbers in markets that we don't have a carrier status. There might be a state where we have a customer we sold to them in Ann Arbor, Michigan, but they have an office in Austin, Texas. And we don't have numbers in Austin, Texas, so we'll work with one of our partners to get that. The good news is that just by virtue of us being having our own OCN, we can still sign numbers that we resold from somebody else. We didn't have to go get their permission. We can go in there and sign them because because of the OCN status. So that kind of a nice umbrella effect here. Then back to our CCA group, one of the major concerns here is for the preponderance of them, they do not have access to their own phone numbers. They will resell them from another provider. So this was brought up the FCC and then in the industry forums, and this was actually acted upon. So now there's really two ways you can go about it to get into this to sign calls. So there's one concept called certificate delegation. So the way the certificate delegation works is that you sourced your numbers from somebody, and what they did then is they said, I'm going to delegate you permission to create your own signatures for these numbers that I know that you were assigned, and then you can participate in this arena. This also goes true for an enterprise. It might not just be a service provider. Maybe it's a contact center, and they're getting numbers from all over the place, and they need a way to do it. And you're, as a service provider, you're saying, hey, listen, okay, I know you're working with these things. You can do it on your own. So there's two parts to that certificate delegation. Now, more recently, though, the FCC just came out with this robocall mitigation database. And in there, it basically said, hey, you don't even have to worry about certificate delegation. You can go right to the front of the line as long as you comport to being in this database and doing the things that allow you to get into that good favor of being in a part of it. So those are the three ways to be participatory in signing of calls. So either you're an OCN operator, or you've gotten delegated certificates, or you participate straight into that robocall mitigation database.
Yeah, and those two last points that you brought up were one of the key sticking points of the original stir-shaken criteria, right? Because it's great that the service providers could sign their own numbers, but then there are so many complicated scenarios where, as you say, a contact center, or for example, a hosted reminder, appointment reminder, medical doctors and school closures and reverse 911, these service providers need to be able to use their client's telephone number, which they usually get from some other service provider. The number originally came from some other service provider. So they have to be able to use it on their behalf. And that's where the certificate delegation kicks in.
Right.
So yeah, that's
And
a
that
good
was one
point.
of the things, Alan, that with the CCA, we were out at the FCC early on talking about these different use cases. And it really came into the notion of about, the enterprise was a different duck, and you really had to make sure there was legitimate reasons why you would change the caller ID and use it in different ways that would allow people to do legitimate robocalling or spoofing. For example, there's a spoofing thing that's very common right now if you're doing any type of soft phone client service. So if you have one of the services we have soft phones that run on your desktop and then on your mobile device. And the whole idea about your mobile device is that if it has your personal identity on there, right, your own phone number, making a call out is not a great thing to go to you from your own personal number. So with the application, it's able to say, hey, no, the call coming from this is actually the business identity. So you can keep that dichotomy between personal and business, which hyper-technically is a spoofing thing that just took place there.
Yep. Well, that's another good use case. Okay. So the difference between, what's shaken trying to accomplish versus what's blocking trying to accomplish.
Yeah. So this one was important because once again, the whole stir shaken stuff was about putting some meat into the mechanics of how traffic is exchanged so that you can discover things about it. There was a traceability, like you mentioned earlier, Alan, about the breadcrumbs going back. That's huge, because to be able to go and try to find a bad actor and do it rapidly, literally in real time, versus waiting, who knows, weeks, months, the bad actors, they're gone. They're someplace else. So the traceability, the enforcement concepts within this thing, that the service provider is actually able to assert stuff. It has no real say whether there's a malicious intent or not. It's just trying to instrument it so that you can kind of work with a call in a way that you never did before. So it's part of a thing that you would use to block calls, but it's not the whole thing. So as we talked about earlier, there's other analytic engines, different ways to get some type of sense of whether the intent is good or not good. So for example, one of the things that we do in terms of blocking calls at our company is that we know there's certain databases that they're called do not originate databases. And so for example, the IRS has its main number. If you want to call their main number, they publish it, but they never originate a call using that main number. So it's on a do not originate database. So if all of a sudden you see the IRS's number coming at you, it's like, okay, this is not right. And you can just go shut that one down right away. That's one of those. So this is where the analytics and the rest of the story comes in to the equation.
Good. Yeah. So quick summary on that particular element.
Yeah. So as we talked about before, there's a sense of urgency here, right? There's a deadline coming up in June, and you need a technology platform, that hopefully you've been looking at some of the good solutions that they're out there. We're really excited about the one that we currently use. And you also need to understand there's certain things here about, once again, the limitations we talked about telephone numbers. Just the concept, like a service provider having an LCR, if you're sending out a call, that you could pick different routes that you're sending out to, it's key to understand some of these particular limitations and so forth. And then you want to get that code. You want to get that service provider code. Now there's 3 bytes at that apple, although that robocall one probably will not be fully in play until after June 30th. So really it's about the OCN methodology, the certificate delegation, and then getting ready for the OCN, or for me, the robocall mitigation database. The good news there is that if you actually want to buy some time in terms of an extension, you could, and that looks like a better way to go, then there will be some time to make that transition. On the regulation front, the whole idea of blocking increases a sense of urgency. But the good news is there, once again, this is one thing that the CCA worked really hard on, is that if you're going to give somebody safe harbor, you have to be able to give blocking notifications right away and have a mechanism to get that redressed within a short period of time. And that is part of what the FCC's regulations are now with the TRACED Act. So this was a really important item. There's a group called the Industry Traceback Group. And this is being managed by US Telecom. Our organization is actually a member of the steering committee of that group. And this is the kind of the gatekeeper. So if there's unwanted behavior or what's going on, this is the vetting organization that takes a look at what might be malicious activity and then would reach out to service providers and try to make sure that they are participatory in trying to solve this problem and ferret out the bad actors. So your cooperation with respect to the ITG is very important. One of the other things here is it's kind of an interesting one. Although we're adding value back into the network, a service provider cannot charge for this service. So there'll be some costs. You got technology to put together. You have different actions in that regard, but you're not to be charging the end user. Mm-hmm. In terms of best practices, the FCC does have, a code of best practices thing about what a mitigation program would look like. But it gets back to, do you know your customers? Are you addressing any abuse? Are you looking at how your traffic patterns are going? And then this last point here is actually an interesting one for the industry. It's called rich call data, or next generation CNAM. And this is where in that same header that you're sending out that has the shaken attestation and so forth, it now presents an ability where you can have a company put in a sense, their business card. So instead of relying on the legacy CNAM concepts, this now actually is coming across where if you got an A-level attestation and you can insert ostensibly your business card in there, or a picture or a website or a logo, now you're really increasing the probability somebody's going to go and pick up that call. So it could be like, for example, you hired out a contractor, a plumber, to come to your house, and they're going to call you and give you a 15-minute notice. Well, when that comes across there, you might have never seen that number ever, but if it came across, yeah, that's Joe's Plumbing, and there's the picture of the service tech, this is actually a unique opportunity that does have a value that could be a source of revenue too. So, yeah,
no, that one's interesting.
Yep.
We could do another whole webinar just on that.
Yes, we could. Yeah. Yes, we could.
Yeah. All right. So number 3 is a robocall mitigation, because we talked a little bit about some of the holes and some of the extensions that people are getting, but this requires some robocall mitigation. So let's just cover this quick. We got one slide on this.
Yeah, to kind of round things out for everybody is that, so this is all about getting, you got garbage in, garbage out. This is the whole thing about stopping the garbage from coming in. So what they're looking for, what the industry wants, what the FCC wants is a mitigation program with which you're defining the practices that can be expected to significantly reduce the origination of illegal robocalls. Mm-hmm. And that you're participating in these traceback efforts. And so once again, the FCC's provide guidelines on this thing. I would encourage everybody, I think we have some links to this stuff that we could share as to how you go there and get a little bit more of a template on this stuff.
Yeah, and that's kind of reinforced. That's an important thing. This is at the origination, the originating service provider that they're going to have some mechanism in place to squash the robocalls before they ever leave their network. Detect and squash them before they leave their network. And this is a critical piece in part of the war, is to stop before they permeate into the network and weave their way through some of the transit carriers and make a mess of the network. So this is going to be interesting. So now we're going to move on to talk about implementing STIR/SHAKEN, and we've got a couple of slides here. We at Telco Bridges have been working very hard over the last few years on a stir-shaken solution. We've been working very closely with a partner of ours, TransNexus, one of our alliance partners. And I want to walk you through real quick what we've put together as a group. So you can imagine in the bottom left here, there's a calling party. They're going into their service provider through a soft switch in an IP-based network. So this is a SIP network. That soft switch on its way out of the network before it heads off to the terminating service provider is going to pass through one of our Pro SBC session border controller platforms. And that SBC is going to have a special script loaded into it that we publish as part of our support materials that will divert that call up to TransNexus's Clear IP shaken authentication service, which is in the cloud. That authentication service has all the rules in it as to who to attest to or not, and at what level. And then it goes through the process of signing the call and then delivering that signed token back to the session border controller. The session border controller, of course, packs it all up as part of the SIP invite and sends it on its way off to the terminated service provider. Over at the terminated service provider, it's kind of the reverse, right? The SBC is at the point of ingress off the wholesale network. We do this very similar thing. We forward that SIP message, but this one has the token within it to TransNexus's Clear IP verification service. They reach out to the certificate repository and get the certificate for that particular call, unpack it, and either say it's good with a verstat or not, and then send back that response to the SBC, who then relays that off to the soft switch, and then a soft switch can then, deliver the call or potentially redirect it, or maybe it's got some kind of robocall mitigation algorithm within it to either deflect those calls or properly deliver the call to the called party with a display that indicates it was verified or potentially spam. So it's a fully comprehensive solution that we've worked on. We've deployed into a number of service providers and got some nice stories to share on how this works. So this is a well-integrated solution for SIP networks. But not everybody's got a SIP network. As you heard Mark talk about, he's still got some TDM in his network. So that we also have a solution that we put together for the TDM network providers, which leverages our media gateways instead of the session border controller. We've essentially implemented that same functionality that we talked about earlier in our media gateways. A called party comes in maybe through a TDM switch and then lands at the media gateway. The media gateway converts it to SIP, sends it over to Clear IP. Clear IP again returns the token back to the gateway. But the gateway, of course, doesn't know how to pass that token along to the destination service provider, right? Because it's a TDM call. If it's going out over ISIP SS7, there's no token. So what the standards body and what TransNexus has been working on with those standards bodies is this concept of this out-of-band shaken. And this is where the identity token at the authentication service is going to be placed in a common location called a call placement service. And then just deliver the call over TDM. So even though the call is TDM, there is a identity token that's dropped into that independent location, a call placement service. At the receiving terminating service provider, again, it's kind of the reverse. The TDM call arrives at the media gateway. The media gateway then converts it to SIP, sends it over to Clear IP. Clear IP then goes and looks in the call placement service for that service provider, finds the identity token, and then can finish the authentication, returning the verstat back to the media gateway, and then the media gateway can use its routing rules to either manipulate the CNAM on the call or pass the call along to the switch and have it delivered to the called party. So either one of these, either a TDM or a SIP-based solution, can be used on either side. So you can have a SIP originating service provider and a TDM terminating service provider, or vice versa, or all SIP or all TDM. And we explain this. This is obviously a mouthful, but we explain this in a lot more detail and something we're going to share with you in just a couple of minutes. The other thing that pops up is, how do I implement robocall mitigation, right? So you've signed up for the extension and you're working on a solution for implementing stir shaken? How do you do this robocall mitigation? Well, we've also just done a very simple robocall mitigation solution with TransNexus using their Clear IP platform. It's just basically one half side of that, what we showed you earlier. The SBC or the media gateway can forward a call over to Clear IP to use their robocall mitigation algorithm to come up with a score. And based on that score, the SBC or the gateway can then determine whether or not to send low risk calls on to the destination operator. Or if it's a high risk, it can deep six it, send it to the bit bucket in the sky. So this is a great solution to meet those requirements near term. It's cloud-based. It slips right into an existing network very cost-effectively, and we see this as being a great option for those people trying to meet those deadlines. So a little bit more to learn more, as I promised you, we've put together a full comprehensive stir shaken solution brief and posted it on our website. This is a very concise overview of not only what we've talked about when it comes to the problem and some of the objectives for stir shaken, but also it goes into more depth of the theory of operation that we were able to talk about here today, and showing both a solution for SIP and TDM providers, and with some links off to some additional resources beyond that. And you can find that at our freesbc.telcobridges.com/stir-shaken as a resource. And of course, we'll put that link in the follow-up email, so you don't have to write it down. Also, too, there's a resource from Addis that very recently was published called the Addis Report on Robocalling. This is a 85-page report that covers a whole lot more than we possibly could talk about today. And again, we'll put a link in the follow-up email to give you some more resources on that. And lastly, we want to point out, we've got more information on our ProSBC on prosbc.com, but as we talked about, it's a session border controller for cloud or bare metal virtualized platform with a software subscription pay-as-you-grow pricing, and our friends over at TransNexus with their Clear IP platform offer that cloud-based stir shaken and robocall blocking service, and their pricing is all transaction-based, which makes it very easy to grow into it. So with that, looks like we've got quite a few questions, so I'm going to move over to that. Mark, and see, we're going to play Stump the Expert here real quick. So we already asked a question that Michael posed about the caller ID attestation. The attestation does not appear on the person's screen, but the service provider can use that results of that to modify the display. So Chris asked a question of robocaller bad actors working to actively to game the new system, and while we're busily trying to implement it. So I would guess yes, but this is a tough nut to crack. So thoughts on that?
Oh, you can bet your bottom dollar they're out there working around it, because it's how the game works, right? You go and put up a defensive mechanism, and the bad guys start to work around it. But this is why it goes back to that one of those slides earlier, where this is a team sport, and if we're working together in all these different vectors as an industry and so forth, we're able to then continue to improve the system. A bad actor could come in, and this is what like the importance of really knowing your customer and who you let in the door, because that'll probably be the most likely place where somebody comes in, they look legit, they come in there and they go wacky for a while, and then they vanish. So once again, I think this is why the team sport aspect of this is very important.
And I think probably one of the biggest weaknesses is that there's going to be a service provider that's going to offer numbers to gray numbers to people, and there is a mechanism to shut those people down, but it doesn't happen instantly. So So Colleen asks, will attestation A to C guarantee terminating carrier will deliver the call, but not guarantee it will not be marked spam? What happens to the calls after June 30th if there's no signature? So thoughts on that?
Yeah. So once again, the stir shaken framework here is providing this ability to do trace back and provide these different levels of attestation. The terminating service provider, is going to use it as piece of the puzzle, not the whole puzzle. Once again, so
Right.
before you mark it as spam, you really would have had to go on and look to see, like was talked about earlier, was it being, what was the nature, how much frequency was going on in that calling patterns before you could really say, hey, this smells like a rat, and I'm gonna mark it as spam.
Right.
And then if there is no signature that's coming through, it's basically going to be assumed to be. I never really thought about this one per se, but the least of all this is a C, but maybe there's actually a D here where there's no signature, whatever, and that's
right.
So.
Yep. Yeah. So Douglas got a sort of interesting situation. A service provider said they will not give an attestation because we're replacing reminder calls for customers using their DID with their permission. They tell us there's no way to do this for the circumstance. I would think we'd be able to provide a letter of agreement or intent, I guess it is. This is just an instance of our provider not being able to handle this. They told us it was an industry-wide issue. And I think we addressed this probably halfway through the deck there, talking about this, the delegated certificates. So you think that would do the trick?
There's a couple of ways to go about it. If you're a bigger, organization that is a big call center or something like that, your ability to sign your own stuff is part of that whole certificate delegation thing. But if you're not of that one and you're just working to do your job and you're a known customer, then I would say that this is pretty draconian here. It gets back to knowing your customer, making sure that they're there, and the idea of a letter of authorization. We would be more sympathetic to that kind of thing because once again, you're doing your own diligence on that particular use case for that customer.
Right.
So one, there is a formal mechanism if you want to get to sign your own calls. And the other one is really, the nature of the service provider you're working with, and are they going to work with you, or are they going to try to draw a hard line there?
Yeah, interesting problem. So let's see. Michael asked a question. When will you be able to get listed on the FCC robocall mitigation? I think you said it was just a couple of months out.
Yeah, it comes at the end of the quarter, and then it really, in terms of full measure, it's right like at the same time in June where you can get into the database.
Right. And then Elil asked a question. This system is, what other regions can we expect this? Outside the U.S. And I've heard some rumblings about it in Latin America. I've heard some rumblings about it in frankly, some small parts of Europe, but nowhere near like it affects the U.S. and Canada. So I don't know. Do you have anything else to add to that?
Sure. The United States in this regard is definitely taking the lead, and so the same type of mechanisms I know are being discussed in Canada. Right. But as we move over to Europe, the key concern in terms of the European markets is about that gateway concepts that you mentioned earlier. So companies like British Telecom and so forth, they're trying to send legitimate traffic to the United States. And if you're using a US-based phone number as your source of identity, so you have like a call center somewhere out that's in UK, for example, and they're originating a call using a United States number, well, it's going to come in, it's going to look suspect right there, and they don't have the same stir-shaken constructs in Europe. They're trying to figure it out. So now it comes across the pond, and you hit the gateways, and that's where they get labeled with a C. And they're really trying to make it better on that score. So, so once again, this is one of the things the United States kind of leading the way, and then we're trying to resolve out some of these, once again, where the legitimate calls are coming from and how to make sure that they're not watered down.
Sure. That's good. Well, it looks like that's the end of our list here. Mark, first of all, I want to thank you for all your time and putting together the material for today's session, and definitely all your leadership in the CCA and helping the organization navigate these complicated waters.
My pleasure.
Yep. And also want to thank our listeners here today. It was great to have you along. And as I said earlier, we're going to send out an email probably tomorrow morning with a copy of the slides and a recording of today's event, and including all those links to the other resources. So with that, I'm going to say thanks everyone for listening. Thanks again, Mark, and everyone have a great day, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Al.